Today, we're going to have this reading from Jeremiah chapter 31. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about some things that I wish I had learned when I was in Sunday school, because if I had learned them then, there are parts of the Old Testament that would have made a lot more sense than they did to me. So let's start with this. Who's this? Who is this? Can you tell? Yeah, this is David. And this is David. He has just conquered Goliath. And when David gets older, here at this age, David is a young boy, and he's a shepherd. When he gets older, what does David become? David becomes king. He becomes not the first king. We often talk like he's the first king. He's actually the second king of Israel, and he unites the nation, and he consolidates power. Okay, about when did that happen? Oh, exactly a long time ago. Yes, a long time ago that happened. That happened. David becomes king in about 1000 BC. We don't know exactly, but it was about 1000 BC, so it was about 3,000 years ago David becomes king. And then David has a son named Solomon. Actually, he has lots of sons, but yes, I was looking for Solomon. Good job reading my mind. And Solomon becomes king. Yes, Solomon becomes the king. And after Solomon becomes the king, what happens? The kingdom breaks into two. You can tell who teaches Sunday school because they know the answers. Yeah. So then Solomon becomes king, and after he becomes king, the kingdom breaks into two, and there's a northern kingdom called Israel, and there's a southern kingdom called Judah. Judah is where Jerusalem is. This map has the boundaries at least approximately in the right places. And that happened about when? About 930 BC. About 70 years after David unites the kingdom, becomes the second king. So Israel was only this larger nation that we think of for about 70 years, and then it breaks up. And as time goes on, what happens is that most of the kings of Judah, and essentially all of the kings of Israel, are not very good kings. They don't take care of the poor, and they don't encourage the people to worship the true God. So after a while, the Assyrians come along. This happens in about 720, and they conquer much of what we now call the Middle East, including the northern kingdom of Israel. They conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. This next map is a little bit harder to see, but I want to put it up because if you look closely, it's hard to see on here. But there's a little yellow thing that says Judah in the middle of this big green that is all of the land that Assyria has conquered. Assyria doesn't actually conquer Jerusalem. They don't actually conquer Judah. They kind of beat the heck out of them, but they don't actually conquer the city. So Judah remains sort of semi-independent during this time. That happens in about 720. And then a little bit over 100 years later, just before 600, the Babylonians come along. The Babylonians, they become the dominant empire in what we would call the Middle East. And beginning in about 605 or 606, not only Israel, but also the nation of Judah, the southern kingdom, is under Babylonian control. They are resistant, but they are under Babylonian control. So for about the next 20 years, they're in a semi-permanent state of rebellion against the Babylonians. And finally, the Babylonians get really, really angry. And in 587, they come in and they destroy Jerusalem. Jerusalem is also called Zion, by the way. When you hear the word Zion, you should realize that's just another word for the town of Jerusalem. And they destroy Jerusalem. They destroy the temple. And this period is what is sometimes referred to as the exile, or it is sometimes referred to as the Babylonian captivity. During the Babylonian captivity, can we see this well enough to tell what's going on here? Who's this guy standing over here on the side? Daniel. Okay, this is a picture of Daniel like he's old. Some pictures of Daniel make it seem like he's young at this time. He was probably about 80 when he gets thrown in the lion's den. But here he is with a bunch of lions just looking at him, and he's standing there, and those lions do not touch him. That event happened during the Babylonian captivity because Daniel just simply refused to go along with the orders of the Babylonians in terms of how he was supposed to worship and the gods he was supposed to worship. So that is a very, very brief summary of approximately 500 years of the history of Israel, which puts this text from Jeremiah that we're going to read today in some kind of historical context. And the problem with reading the prophets is, and it used to really drive me nuts, is the prophets don't make much sense unless you know what's going on historically when this prophet was writing. So Jeremiah is a prophet during the time of the rise of Babylon, and then during the time right after Judah has been conquered, right after Jerusalem has been destroyed. And he is writing to give people hope in their time of captivity.